Now you can see it. All right, I'm showing you some pages here of the chapter on the Upland South, okay? And what we want to look at, and by the way, feel free to bring your laptops to class because I know this is, sometimes it's difficult to see. And I'll try to get this available to you, but I will get this available to you, but not today. But anyway, this map is obviously from the textbook, from the textbook on the Upland South. What is the Upland South? How does it differ from the Lowland South? Well, there's sort of the physiographic component of that, the physical geography, and most of the time the boundary between the Lower South and the Upland South involves a physiographic difference, and that may just be kind of random, but you've got an idea here of the fall line, right? We've talked about the fall line, right? So the Piedmont and the mountains of the Appalachians are certainly part of the Upland South, and the Lowland South is going to be differentiated from flatter terrain, terrain that is more attuned to production of cash crops like tobacco and later on cotton. And then, the idea of a differentiation between a lowland South and an upland South toward the west, at least on the interior, really becomes a matter of what is the most important economic crop that was grown there. And also, with that crop, okay, with the form of labor utilized in that crop production system. So you're probably following me now. So we have the plantation South, or really the tobacco, and by about 1790 or so, after 1790, the cotton South, and the slave South, the slavery South. So this is, eventually the cotton belt. And so that the lowland South's expansion was driven largely after 1790. It largely began around 1800, okay? So, and the expansion of the cotton South, of course, was dependent on the development of the ability to gin cotton efficiently, right? And so who was that individual? Remember that?
Eli Whitney.
Eli Whitney, yeah. So Eli Whitney supposedly invents this cotton gin. What does the cotton gin do?
Goes in and picks apart all the little
Pulls seeds. Yeah, pulls the seeds out of cotton. Now, how did they do that before without a machine?
Slave labor.
Yes, by hand. But if you all have ever picked cotton and felt the seeds and pulled that cotton out, you have to use a hand tool. And it's very, very difficult with the type of cotton that we grow around here now and then. The type of cotton that was used was a different type of cotton called black seed cotton, okay? Black seed cotton was, or sometimes referred to as Sea Island cotton. You ever heard of the Sea Islands in South Carolina? So this area from, about Savannah, Georgia on up to Charleston or a little farther north along the coast is the area where you have some sea islands. Speaking of slavery and the Civil War, the island off the coast of Charleston, right? What's the name of that island? There was a fort there. What was it? Fort Sumter, yeah. And so Fort Sumter was the sort of starting ground for the Civil War. But the Sea Island right through here, the Sea Islands are where that black seed cotton was produced for quite a long time. Now, there was a very limited amount of cotton, that black seed cotton, that could be produced. It was a very high quality. You could grow the other type of cotton, but problem was black seed cotton wouldn't survive outside of this special sort of, maritime environment. You couldn't grow the black seed cotton into the interior. So the other type of cotton that became important after Eli Whitney was green seed cotton. And green seed cotton could grow all over the place, all over the South. And the technology of the cotton gin allowed green seed cotton to replace black seed cotton in the market. So suddenly, you could grow cotton pretty much throughout the South. Land was available and virtually free, and the production of cotton then was based primarily on labor, primarily on the ability to pick mostly, to pick and of course to cultivate and clear land. So with land sort of the easy part of the factor of production in cotton, labor was the difficult one. And early on, most of the cotton plant, many of the producers of cotton were non-slave owners, for sure. But you could make, once you had a labor supply at a certain level, then you could really make some large amounts of money. All right, well, I didn't really intend to get into the Cotton Belt so much as the Upland South, but we have a staple production that's going to expand westward right after the United States federal Constitution's ratified and when we have our first census. And so the expansion west of the Cotton Belt is driven by the search for cotton lands, good lands, and the availability of transport. So we know that Mississippi Territory was settled generally from the east up to about Alabama, right? And Mississippi was then settled from the Mississippi River toward the east. So you have a kind of a pincher movement of settlement throughout this part of the lower South during the early 1800s. Now, where was the Creek War fought? Alabama. And where was Fort Mims?
South.
Right about here, just a little north, about 35 miles north of Mobile, present-day Mobile. Okay. And who was, what native people, what indigenous group were in control of this area?
The Creeks.
The Creeks. And who are the Creeks? Well, the Creek Confederacy, okay, were an organized version, somewhat organized body of different tribal towns and population centers that they called towns, not necessarily like with a main street, right? Not at all like that. A town was more like a rural settlement, a large rural settlement area where people recognized that place as theirs. So the Creeks were Muskogean-speaking people who were referred to as the Creeks, and there were many of them. Were in control of this general area. Okay. Now, these were people who were split between people who had a lot of contact with whites and the people who had not had a lot of contact with the Anglo-Americans. And those people who had a lot of contact over several generations had intermarried and taken up the folk culture of the Southerners, and in some cases even taken up the practice of African slavery. And so there were people who we might today call sort of the acculturated Creeks, okay? The acculturated Creeks, and they were on both sides, but you read about the lower Creeks and the upper Creeks, and there were factions on both of those sides. But during the War of 1812 and the attempt by the British to sort of retake their colonies, in around 1812, you have a lot of interaction between British agents, Spanish folks down here in the Gulf Coast area, and the Creeks. And the Creeks began to ally with, or a faction of the Creeks who were all for protecting their territory against American expansion, became known as the warlike Creeks, or the Muskogean culture sort of divides things between white and as peace and red as war. And so they call themselves the Red Sticks. And that's where we get the term Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But the Red Sticks, or the Red Stick Creeks, became a group of people who were allied with groups of Cherokees who were anti-American. They wanted to, they had lost lands in Virginia and elsewhere and had been forced down into this part of Alabama and Georgia. And they called themselves the Chickamaugas. So the Chickamaugas and the Red Sticks were allied against the Americans, receiving information and intelligence and supplies from the British with the help of the Spanish. Okay, so the Spanish and the British were actually cooperative here. And so anyway, the Creek War is really international to a degree. So you've read maybe a little bit about it with David Crockett. And so anyway, the folks who had more connections with the Anglo-Americans were divided. So the Creeks and the Cherokees were both divided. You might recall that during the Creek War, Andrew Jackson, well, there were some important battles, of course, but the decisive battle was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, I believe. You remember that? At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson depended on the assistance of a large number of Cherokees who were not Chickamaugas. They were allied with the Americans. So a lot of Cherokees assisted in that battle that was a decisive victory for the Americans against the Creek Confederacy. Now, during the Creek Confederacy was analogous to Tecumseh's attempted confederacy up here around the Great Lakes, and the Shawnees and other groups who had banded together in an attempt to be a contestant against the expansion of American power into the Middle West. So this is the Creek War. This going on about the same time that you have, Tippecanoe and that kind of thing. So, the lowland South is this sort of a theater for the Creek War. You're going to be reading about with Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett. Sorry, they come from the same place, pretty much. But Crockett is a migrant. His ancestors came from the Ulster plantation in what is today Northern Ireland, came through Philadelphia, migrated down through southeast Pennsylvania into Virginia, made it all the way down into what would become the valley of East Tennessee that you're looking at here, which included the attempted state of Franklin, right? And then Crockett settles at various places, eventually makes it over here to sort of what we would call Middle Tennessee, just north of the Alabama line, where he gets most of his political experience as a member of the Tennessee legislature, and then eventually as a United States congressman, right? So and then, of course, when he loses his second shot at reelection, well, I told you the story, right? He gets kind of dissatisfied and winds up going to Texas, and we know the story from there. Upland Southerner. So Crockett is, by definition, an Upland Southerner. He's a product of culture that had that had emerged from a blend of mostly British, but some German immigration into southeast Pennsylvania, and the expansion of those people into the valleys of the Ridge and Valley and into the Upland South. These were people who were too far away from markets to produce, at least at this point, they were too far away from urban markets or seaports to produce plantation crops. Okay, so without plantation crops, there was no real demand for slavery, and so this area remained pretty much an area where slavery was odd and was not very common in the Highlands. Okay, it remained relatively a mix of Anglo and German folks, and then Native Americans. In the lowland areas, of course, very different. Native Americans pretty much have been removed much earlier, and you have a more or less biracial population. In some places, African American population reaching beyond 50% of the total population here. And that would be also true for the Tidewater prior to 1800. Now, there were a few exceptions to that. So the exceptions in terms of plantation production were initially the Bluegrass Basin of Kentucky and the Nashville Basin around Nashville, Tennessee. And this one, these were both areas that migrants went to. Daniel Boone, as you know, was the one who, the individual who was responsible or got the credit for blazing the Wilderness Road into this part of Kentucky. And I'm pointing at this area right here because this is a pass known as what? In the Appalachians, you have passes. You have highland passes, and in the Rockies, we generally call them passes. But in the Appalachians, they're generally referred to as gaps. And there are two types of gaps. There are the water gaps, where there's a river running through it, and then there are wind gaps, where the river that was there at one time has disappeared because it's been captured. So you have and that's the case for Cumberland Gap right here, the wind gap, and the interstate highway goes through it now. But this was where the migrants coming down through the Great Valley would hang a right and go up into Kentucky. And this route right through here was treacherous because it had to, you were going over the Appalachian Plateau, a very highly dissected limestone and sandstone plateau, very, very difficult terrain to move, not necessarily people or even horses, but you couldn't necessarily move freight from the farm. You couldn't economically transport farm products, especially the products that could grow like corn, couldn't transport them very easily from the bluegrass to the Great Valley and then off to market. Okay? But the bluegrass, of course, was over here, and there was obviously the Ohio River right here. So the Bluegrass Basin became the first major agricultural production area that was dependent on the Ohio River. The Nashville Basin was kind of its younger little sister. But it would also have if you look on the map, the Nashville Basin has water access through the Cumberland River, which kind of flows like this. And the Cumberland River provides access to the Mississippi system, okay? So these agricultural regions, or these lands that were coveted by Western migrants, I say Western migrants, they're by, frontier folks moving in, they were looking for these lands. So what made these lands special? Anybody know? What would Nostrand tell you? Well, these areas, okay, these areas have a certain type of bedrock that when it breaks down, that geology, that particular bedrock produces very, very high quality soils, good for farming. And the type of bedrock is, anybody know? Limestone, okay? Limestone. So these are basins that have exposed limestone bedrock. If you've ever driven through Nashville or driven through, especially into the Nashville Basin or into the Bluegrass Basin, you cross through these escarpments of limestone. It's real obvious. But within the basin, it's the soils are based on limestone soils, and they're very, very high quality. They can be utilized for a very long amount of time. And the Bluegrass Basin and the Nashville Basin both became important agricultural areas, and the first areas within the upland South, really, that where plantation production got established, and therefore slavery. So the Bluegrass Basin and the Nashville Basin have, for the upland South, a very different demographic. So you have the same Anglo and German farming folk and plantation owners, but African American slave populations early on into this area, okay? Now, you know this area of Kentucky. It's the area that when you're driving through it, you see these beautiful big wooden fences and big, elegant homes, a lot like the plantation South to some degree, but you also see a lot of livestock. What kind of livestock?
Horses.
Horses. What kind of horses?
Thoroughbred.
Thoroughbred horses, because this is the area that produces a lot of thoroughbred horses, because there's a great important horse race. Where, about right here?
Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, Louisville, the Kentucky Derby, right? Okay. Now, this area was not always a horse-producing area. Initially, it produced corn, and over time, the crops evolved toward what we call regional specialization. So this is pretty much a rule for agricultural settlement. At first, the generalist arrives. The generalists are the ones who are subsistence agriculturalists. So they're growing corn. They may grow some tobacco for their own use. They may grow some, they may have some livestock, milk cow, hogs. But they're just making a go of it, and they're only subsisting. They're not producing for a large market. Over time, if transportation allows, then they may start producing more and more of another crop that they can market for cash, okay? But that is not where it stops. Eventually, you'll find that certain areas will encourage the production of certain types of crops because maybe the soils are excellent, or maybe the transportation access is excellent, or both. And so here we have in the Bluegrass Basin the early development of crops like tobacco, all right? So it's an early inland tobacco production area. And in addition to tobacco, there are other crops that are experimented with, including things like flax. What do you use flax for?
Rope.
Digestive health.
Did you make rope?
Flax.
Linen.
Linen. And linen was actually the linen, linens were generally the type of cloth that people wore for clothing before cotton became so cheap and before the price of cotton fell. So back in the days of Sea Island cotton, people were producing flax to produce linens for clothing and for textiles. But once cotton expanded through here and cotton became king by the early 1800s, or 1820s, 1830s, expanding through here, what happened to the price of cotton? And cotton is a superior, in most ways, a superior material to linen. Now, you can still buy clothing made out of linen, but what do you know about linen shirts? I've got a few in my closet. They never come out of the closet. The linen stuff never comes out of the closet, especially in the summertime, because it's real hot. It doesn't breathe very well. It's not like cotton. Cotton's fantastic. It's a superior crop in a lot of ways. So as cotton expands and the price of cotton falls, people switch to cotton, and there's no more market for things like flax. Okay. Well, now we grow flax for the flaxseed oil and stuff like that, right? Which is a decent market. Some other things that they were growing. You said rope. What did they produce? What did they make a lot of things out of that? You're coming back. Another product that they grew in the bluegrass was hemp. Okay, so you know hemp. Okay, so hemp was another, and this is not marijuana. This is just a crop that had a lot of different uses, and we're sort of rediscovering all of those important uses, other than the psychedelic or whatever you call it, psychotropic or whatever they are. But hemp was actually a pretty important crop for a while. Now, a little farther south in the Nashville Basin, so what happens? You have the transformation of those crops, and eventually the crop that became very attractive in the bluegrass basin is the fact that it was good grazing. Now, the bluegrass basin and the Nashville Basin being limestone bedrock. If you've had any physical geography or geology, what's a characteristic of limestone areas that are covered with limestone?
It's porous, so there can be a lot of caves that form.
Exactly. It's called a karst environment, K-A-R-S-T. And that porosity is caused because limestone is water soluble. So you have a characteristic on the terrain. The characteristic is that there usually are no rivers, no surface drainage of any kind, or at least not very much. And the surface drainage doesn't exist because all the water pretty much percolates down and flows underneath the cavern systems. And so, you have, well, you're familiar with the Mammoth Cave area, right? So Mammoth Cave area. Anyway, the limestone, the Bluegrass Basin and the Nashville Basin are areas that have kind of unique drainage characteristics. You don't have rivers that connect off with, in a very dense pattern. So this is an area where basically you have the emergence of more of a pastoral type of work. Well, anyway, we'll get into the evolution later. So just keep in mind that over time, certain areas, for whatever reason, maybe it's because of the resource base, but maybe it's because of historical inertia, or maybe it's because of some other competitive advantage, areas generally will become specialized, okay? And in agriculture, you get this specialization going on, mostly due to transportation availability, soils, okay? Now, the area through here, to the lower south, is, and I've penciled in my version of it because I disagree with this sometimes. I think the Upland South would probably include most of West Tennessee, even though it's really flat plantation country up here. Culturally, I would say culturally the boundary is down through here, and I've lived in the lowland South. I've lived in the Upland South, and I've spent a lot of my life in the Upland South and a lot of my life in the lowland South, and I know. How many of you are like that? How many of you have lived in the lowland South and the Upland South and can identify some real differences? Okay. There are some strange differences. And it has to do with things like, well, I guess all I could say is that the Upland South tends to be a lot more, and if you disagree, let me know, a lot more egalitarian, a lot more equal. People tend to be more equal. They tend to be poorer, but they tend to be more equal. And in the lowland South, you have a great disparity historically, have great disparities between incomes, so that you have a certain minority of people who have quite a bit, and also you have people who don't have that much, and then you have also at this point slaves. So there's really sort of a three-tiered society, and historians teach us that the upper classes were revered by the lower class whites who aspired to become like them, and there was one way to do that, or there's really just one key to do that, because land was so cheap, almost free, it was through slavery. And so there was this cultural alliance between the poor whites and the plantation owners, the planter class, and slaves were in this caste of people who had no access to change their lot. So this works for a very, very different dynamic culturally. Examples. In my life in the low parts of the lowland South, it was fairly common, and I'm not sure exactly where all this comes from, it was fairly common for upper class whites to have African American folks in their homes taking care of children. And in fact, oftentimes children became very closely associated, closely attached to African American folks who worked with them, okay? And so there was, despite what a lot of maybe things that are written these days might imply, there was actually it tended to be a lot of interaction between whites and blacks, okay? Not equality, but a lot of interaction. While in the Upland South, there really wasn't much interaction between whites and blacks, except for maybe in some of the plantation islands. And, they had, although Upland Southerners understood, slavery, they may not have, they didn't have the same interaction. And I can say, having lived in, Oklahoma, having lived in East Tennessee, I could say that these places tend to be, if you want to talk about racism and that thing, this is where there's a lot more suspicion among whites about African Americans, okay? And there aren't very many African American people. But it's very different. The relationship between races is very, very different in the lower South. And it's of all the places I've lived, the most interesting is in Louisiana, because here there is more diversity in terms of class and less distinction between class and race. Okay, So it's a very interesting place, very dynamic. And so anyway, that's just a little bit of that. All right, so I don't really know how we got on. I liked it. So anyway, where does the Upland South stop? That's the question. Huh?
Mississippi River.
Well, I don't know. Does it stop there? That's a good question. I've drawn in my, I mean, you've got this map in your book, right? I've taken my pencil and extended the Upland South's boundary to between about, I guess this would be like Austin, all the way up to Kansas City, okay? And I'm saying this is Upland South too. Nostrand says, well, it gets kind of sketchy through here, or it gets kind of vague through here, okay? And Nostrand says, it's kind of vague through here too, although I would just take that solid line and say easily Upland South, okay? But where does Upland South end and the Midwest begin? Anybody's guess, right? If you've ever traveled to southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, you know that it's really not entirely different culturally from Kentucky and West Virginia, right? So, and that's largely reflecting things like terrain and historical migration. But what happens here in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas? The upland southern culture somehow sort of sublimates on the Great Plains. It sort of dries up and disappears. And we have in the Great Plains, I'm not sure exactly what, Midwest, maybe a combination of Southwest and Midwest. It's anybody's really, guess. But in the South, the distinction between the Upland South and the Lowland South is a lot more stark, a lot more identifiable. So anyway, the Upland South.